welcome everyone to Your Music, Your Way, the power of improvisation for accessing innate genius and liberating your unique and precious gifts. Today I'm here with Stuart Reid, an amazing scientist and explorer in the sonic realm, who I'm going to introduce here more thoroughly in a couple of minutes. But welcome, Stuart Reid. It's really great to be with you here.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
So we're at a point in human history where it seems to me that one of the most essential skills that we could possibly learn as human beings is to learn how to navigate the unknown with mastery. We've known now, intellectually at least for the last 100 years or so, that reality is comprised primarily of matter and energy that's trading places with each other probabilistically. And so the future is fundamentally unknowable and unpredictable. And now it seems to me that we are feeling it now these days. You know, we're really feeling this as the institutions and the norms and the areas of agreement that have kind of held us together as people are shifting. And we're kind of coming to a point to where we're having to face some choices about whether we are to brace ourselves from the unknown and some of these unknowables, or to embrace the unknown. And fortunately, learning to navigate the unknown with some mastery and some faith gives us confidence, and it can change everything. It can literally change everything. So enter sonic improvisation, and I'm calling it the meditation of the future. It's ancient, we've had it forever, and it's also fresh and new. And it's the spontaneous creation of sound that can really help us to connect with our true innate nature as physical and creative beings, and can help us to express ourselves authentically in any given moment. And so this summit is bringing together a diverse array of musicians and other improvisational artists, sound healers, scientists, ritual leaders, and activists to explore this profound potential of sound to help us live more musically and to affect personal and social and planetary change. So that's kind of what's drawing this whole thing together. So Stuart Reid, he is an acoustics pioneer, a man on a mission to educate and inspire the world in the field of cymatics, the study of visible sound. His cymoscope invention has changed our perception of sound forever. Seeing sound allows us to understand this omnipresent aspect of our world and universe more fully and deeply. His cymatics research is helping to elevate this important new field in the scientific arena, including a study on how dolphins see with sound, published in the Journal of Marine Biology. His two most recent studies focused on the effects of music on the longevity of red blood cells, with a preliminary report published by experiment.com, and on differentiating between the sounds emitted by healthy cells and cancer cells, a scientific paper published by Water Journal. And he's here today to talk about music medicine and how music triggers healing at the cellular level. So again, welcome, Stuart, and I'm so excited to engage in this with you.
Pleasure to be with you.
It's so much fun. My original introduction to you, as we were kind of speaking before we went on air here, is I did get to see an earlier version of your cymoscope in probably 05 or something like that, and it was so fascinating to just speak into this microphone and see these little, like, it was just so fun to just see how different sounds literally were just shaping the shapes on the plate there. So I'd love to hear, what originally inspired you to kind of explore this area of how we can see this and experience sound from a visible standpoint.
Yeah, it'd be a pleasure to explain how I got into all of this. But just to mention that old cymoscope going way back to 2005. I think you're right about the date, by the way. That we're talking there about a cymoscope that used a latex membrane. So, for your viewers not aware of this science, probably a lot of them are, but some might not be. When sound impinges on a membrane, in this case a latex membrane, just a very thin rubbery membrane, of course the sound vibrations cause little undulations in the surface structure of that membrane. And if you sprinkle on sand, then a little bit like, you know, how in the world of forensic science, where you sprinkle on some, you know, talcum powder onto a fingerprint or whatever, the little ridges are made visible by the talcum powder, or the troughs are made visible by the talcum powder. It's the same sort of principle with cymatics in terms of sand or salt on a membrane. It essentially reveals what your eye cannot see. So these little tiny undulations, which are effectively the imprint of the sound on that membrane, are then rendered visible simply by this, you know, the particle matter that you sprinkle on. So that was the very, you know, one of the very first cymoscopes that you saw. Actually started in 2002, but the one in 2005 was just like you just talked about there, with a latex membrane. But now, you know, the cymoscope that we have here behind me is using water. Water is a very, very sensitive, creates a very sensitive membrane surface tension, and you can imprint sound onto that. And the detail that's obtained is exquisite, not only in terms of the surface topology of the water, but also into the depths of the water. Because if you think about it, the sound is actually organizing the water molecules, not just on the surface, but right throughout the whole depth. And this is so important from a medical science point of view, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But to answer your question now, you know, how did I get into all of this? It actually really started in Egypt, because my daddy and I had traveled in Egypt many times, but we were very fortunate in 1996 to be able to enter the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid at Giza by ourselves. You normally, you know, you're there with a gaggle of tourists, and it's very noisy, and you just don't get the spiritual feel of that beautiful chamber when there's a lot of other people there. But anyway, 96, very early in 96, we found ourselves in that chamber alone. And as an acoustics engineer at that time, I was, of course, extremely interested in the granite sarcophagus. You know, this is a 3.7-ton granite box being hollowed out, allegedly for the pharaoh Khufu. Many people don't believe that, but that's another question. But anyway, the fact is that it's a hollowed out block of granite, and if you strike that granite box with the side of your fist like this, it rings like a low-pitched bell. It's a beautiful sound. And I'd known this from previous visits, but on this visit, because we were in there alone, I did something very naughty, which is to lie in that sarcophagus and make a vocal.
In 05.
I know. Yeah, it is naughty, but you know, it doesn't do any harm really to this. I mean, it's granite, for goodness sake, you know.
Yeah.
I don't think the antiquities inspector would be particularly amused by this, but you know, millions of people have done this, including Napoleon Bonaparte, by the way. But anyway, so I lay in the sarcophagus and I made a vocal glissando, not just to hear my own voice, but in fact to try to establish the prime resonant frequency of the sarcophagus just with my own vocal apparatus. And at one particular frequency that was somewhere just over 100 hertz, according to my own ears at the time, something amazing happened, which was that I felt that every cell in my body was tingling. It was an amazing sensation. And having studied acoustics for, you know, at that point about 30 years, I had never come across anything like this at all. And so there and then I realized that something very special was happening. And of course, I wanted to study it. You know, how could we study exactly what was happening there? And so later that same day, you know, my dad and I talked about it, and I decided that I would go back to Egypt when I could get permission and take acoustics instrumentation into the King's Chamber and carry out a series of acoustics tests. Well, I did exactly that. But to keep this whole story short, because you know we're short on time here, let's fast forward, because I actually went to Egypt twice with acoustics instrumentation. The first time was in later that same year, 96, and then again I went in 97. And it's really the 97 experiments that changed my life forever. The 96 experiments were extraordinarily successful, you know, from a standard acoustics point of view. But in 97, I'm going to describe now exactly what happened. So I gained permission again to go. And about 3 weeks before going out to Egypt, I injured my lower back quite badly. And I was in a lot of pain. And at one point I thought, I'm probably going to have to cancel, you know, this mission because I just was in too much pain. But anyway, I kind of just gritted my teeth and I took probably too many painkillers. But anyway, it managed the pain to some extent. And I was able to get into the King's Chamber on this occasion, only with the Antiquities Inspector's assistance. We got in there and I started to set up this particular experiment. The experiment concerned to try to see the resonances that are in that granite sarcophagus. So in 96, I carried out all the standard instrumentation, acoustics instrumentation experiments. This was different. This was to stretch a membrane across the top of the sarcophagus. So the starting point, right across. So the starting point, first you put a little speaker in the bottom of the sarcophagus, inside, right? Then, for those viewers who have been in the Great Pyramid and seen the sarcophagus, you realize that the top is not level. One side of the top has been broken away, and it's a slightly different height to the other side. Well, I had planned all of this, right? So I had taken an aluminum right angle to repair the damaged corner. I'd taken blocks of styrofoam. I'd taken gaffer tape, all sorts of bits and pieces, you know, to effectively repair the sarcophagus. And then I stretched the membrane across the top. And around the periphery were 43 little bags of sand. We collected the sand outside the pyramid, right? We've got a lot of sand in Egypt, you know. And anyway, that created a kind of even torsion, you know, right across the whole surface.
Huh.
And I think the Antiquities Inspector thought I was a bit, you know, not quite right in the but, you know, I had paid the Antiquities Service a lot of money, so they probably thought, well, you know, let this crazy Englishman, you know, do whatever he's doing. It's not doing anything. Anyway, so what then happened was this. I sprinkled sand on, literally again, sand that we'd collected outside the pyramid. Sprinkled that sand onto the membrane evenly, or evenly as I could, switched on the oscillator, electronic oscillator. So now we had a very low pitched tone going into the sarcophagus. And what then happened was absolutely astonishing, because an ancient Egyptian hieroglyph appeared in the sand on the surface of the membrane, right?
I'm getting chills.
I think my mouth must have probably dropped open at this point in shock and awe.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, and then the Antiquities Inspector at this point, he's standing up against the north wall, filing his nails and looking across at me, you know, thinking I'm crazy. But then when this happened, he came running across the chamber, and how you do that? How you do that? You know, he was really excited. I was excited.
I bet.
You know, and then, what can I do? How can I help you? You know, he was now wanting to help in the experiment, right?
Man, sure.
And, so it was an amazing moment, and then Daniel, we proceeded together as a team to look at that frequency, then scrape the sand off, sprinkle more sand on, change the frequency to, you know, something higher, and almost every frequency that we looked at, an ancient Egyptian hieroglyph, different hieroglyph, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, my God, how can this be? You know, what mechanism could possibly cause this to happen? So about 20 minutes into this series of experiments, however, I suddenly realized that all the pain that I had been experiencing, you know, prior to getting into the pyramid,
I knew that pain. I knew that.
What's that, Daniel?
I knew that.
I know. Yeah, I mean, it was just astonishing to suddenly realize that I have no pain. So in that moment, what I thought was, I'm very happy. I'm very excited, of course, seeing all these hieroglyphs. And my bloodstream is obviously flowing with endorphins through this happiness and masking the pain. And when I get back outside the pyramid and get back to the hotel, the pain's going to really come back. But actually, the pain never did come back, right? So I realized that, well, two things. First of all, one, there was definitely a pain, more than a pain mediation mechanism, because mediation of pain is kind of temporary, right? Uh, And so but certainly I had no pain at that point. But later, when back in the hotel, I realized it wasn't just pain mediation. There had been a real healing of my lower back, right? But then the other thing I realized was that this cymatic experiment that I had devised and was having, seeing these hieroglyphs, that could provide a new tool for science, making sound visible in this way. So it was those two events that really just completely changed my life forever. Because at that time I was still in business, in an acoustics engineering business, and but I very quickly sold that business and went into pure research. Just a couple of years later.
Cool. Well, yeah, I love that. You had told me a little bit of this story before, but I didn't hear all that detail, and I didn't hear about the hieroglyph thing on the, on the spread across. Like that's amazing. And a couple of more questions on this particular aspect of the topic before we move on. So I know that Ernst Chladni created, the Chladni plate, and so there's this idea that this kind of thing can happen. But what was it that brought you to the idea of spreading that membrane over the top of the, right?
Well, as an acoustics engineer, Daniel, I suppose any acoustics engineer will know the history of sound, basically, going right back to early times. And so I had a kind of general handle on the history of sound, of course. And one of the books that I had read was concerning Leonardo da Vinci. He wrote some beautiful notebooks, drawings and notes. And one of his entries, going right back to around 1500, concerned when he vibrated a table one day, he saw little little mounds of dust on the table, responding in a very strange way to the vibration. And he didn't take this research any further. He just made a note. Okay, so it was about 300 years later when Ernst Chladni, this is just an assumption of mine, by the way. I don't know this for sure about historically, but it was either Ernst Chladni or Robert Hooke, the English scientist, but one of the two of them must have read, I think anyway, must have read Leonardo's notebooks. Certainly Robert Hooke, the English scientist, he experimented with flour and other particulate matter on glass, and noticed when he vibrated the glass that all sorts of strange patterns occurred. And I think he and Chladni were, close enough contemporaries, perhaps, to be able to. I think Chladni had read some of Hooke's work, and so anyway, however it happened in history, I'm not sure, but certainly the person in history who's most remembered for this science is Chladni, Ernst Chladni, who was a German musician and physicist. And his simple little invention was a plate that we call today a Chladni plate, but basically it was a sheet of metal, sheet of brass usually, on a centrally held on a stand, a little desk stand. And then he would sprinkle sand or salt onto the plate, and he would play the edge of the plate with a violin bow to excite the metal, and then all of these beautiful patterns would occur, geometric patterns, which, in a sense, is the sound made visible. The reason I say in a sense is because most of those patterns are the result of the natural resonances of the plate itself, right?
Mhm.
So you're seeing really you're seeing the sound of the plate made visible, essentially, more than the sound of the violin bow. But it's not entirely true, because the sound of the violin bow is definitely involved as well. But anyway, so Ernst Chladni has certainly gone down in history. And then if we fast forward now, lots of other people involved in the story. Michael Faraday, the English scientist, he also experimented with this same modal phenomena, would be the kind of general scientific term for what we're talking about. But then if we fast forward into the 1960s, Hans Jenny, comes into the picture. And it was Jenny, who was this Swiss medical doctor, who he actually coined this word cymatics, to mean visible sound. And it was Jenny who inspired me, and also to some extent Michael Faraday, into investigating this type of phenomena. So really, it was Jenny more than anyone, and that's why I thought, well, let's use Jenny's idea, stretch the membrane across the sarcophagus, and see what happens. And so, well, you know what happened, and it was phenomenal.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's just so many things. I feel like I could talk to you for days about this stuff. I actually pulled together a talk recently, just a short little 7-minute talk that expresses sort of my take on all this stuff. And I actually quote Jenny. I said Jenny, but it's Jenny apparently.
Jenny.
And he says that the more one looks at these things, the more one appreciates that sound is the creative principle, and that it must be regarded as primordial. And so he apparently has. I mean, that idea, the things that you're talking about are, for me at least, just sort of confirmation that sound is this powerful force, and that that it is organizing things. And when I think of the creation stories from around the world, it always it's like, and God said, and in the center of the universe she sang. Like, sound is the thing that maybe goes from pure consciousness and goes from pure consciousness and then starts vibrating things and creates matter and creates the world. And so this idea that sound is actually not just one of the forms of energy, but it's this or maybe just the semantics of the frequency spectrum, or something that we can hear, is just our own definition of sound. But that energy and frequency and vibration is the thing that creates.
Oh, it's a formative force. There's no question about it. Very quickly, for your viewers, I mentioned two areas where this formative force really needs to be understood. First of all, in the creation of the universe itself, as a mainstream cosmological view, that sound was the most potent force in the universe just following the Big Bang. I think the figure is the first 370,000 years, if I'm remembering it correctly, because I'm not a cosmologist, but I've read a lot on this subject, and I think it's 370,000. That sound was theoretically the most powerful force at that time. And so, according to this mainstream model of cosmology, sound was the means by which the universe organized the matter during that first phase of creation. And it's apparently why, if you look into space with a very powerful telescope, you will see groups of galaxies here, groups of galaxies there, and they are arranged in a very distinctive pattern. They're not random at all. And some people call it the egg carton universe. These groups of galaxies are arranged very specifically, and there are huge distances between, thousands of light years between these big groups. So, and according to this mainstream model, the reason for that is nothing to do with gravitational effects, but everything to do with sound in those first 370,000 years, give or take, right? So what happens is the little quantum fluctuations that occurred immediately after the Big Bang become amplified by the sound and literally cause the matter to go in different places, organized by these, huge sound pressures that would have been around at that time. That's
Yeah.
one creative principle. Another one relates to abiogenesis, which is the creation of life in the primordial oceans of Earth, right? So there's a lot of theories around about how life actually was triggered in the primordial oceans. And one of the reasons, one of the pieces of research which is so interesting in recent times concerns how the oceans were seeded from space by comets. You know, according to the mainstream model, the oceans themselves are the result of cometary impacts, literally bringing water to the Earth. But in addition to that, as you probably know, recent research has been focused on meteors and meteorites in terms of the biological material that they bring to the Earth. And there was an audacious mission a couple of years ago by the European Space Agency, where they literally landed a spacecraft on Comet 67P. They used a mass spectrometer to test the dust on the comet, and lo and behold, they found organic material on the comet in the vacuum of space, right? So this is proving a principle that scientists like Fred Hoyle have been talking about for decades. He's no longer with us, Fred, but you know, Fred Hoyle was one of the proponents who was saying that life was seeded from space. However, it's not entirely true, because I don't think anyway, because the life that they're talking about here are little pieces of organic material like amino acids, simple amino acids and simple sugars. But it's a big stretch to get from simple amino acids and simple sugars to life, you know, a living cell, a living organism. That's a really big stretch. So, okay, how did that happen? Well, this is where sound becomes involved again, right? Because I think most biologists would say that life began around hydrothermal vents. These are vents on the ocean floor where the gases are coming up out of the core of the Earth and entering into the watery environment. And when that happens, of course, there are millions of bubbles that are coming out. You know, the gases literally manifest as bubbles, right? And the size of these bubbles varies from everything from the size of a melon down to really microscopic bubbles, tiny, tiny little bubbles, right? Well, here's where sound comes in, because the work that I've been doing shows that when you have sound and you have a membrane, as I said, you know, right at the beginning of this little talk, you've got to have a cymatic pattern, right? Well, a bubble is a membrane. So when you have sound and you have a bubble, you have to have a cymatic pattern. And I've been actually making these visible in our lab here. And what happens is, if you've got solutes in the water, and the solutes I'm talking about now have been brought to Earth from comets, these are the building blocks of life brought into the oceans, but now they need to be organized, right, into a living cell. How does that happen? Right,
Brilliant.
not a random process, a formative process created by sound. So when you have sound and you have a membrane, you have to have a pattern of energy, and that pattern can organize any solutes in the water into nodes and antinodes. So where there's an antinode, it pushes away the solute, but where there's a nodal part of the pattern, then the solutes can gather in those still areas of the bubble. And I'm talking about microscopic bubbles here, so right down to the size of living cells, right? But that's an organizing principle by which a primordial or proto cell could actually be created. So yes, sound is a very formative force.
And sound would be the unifying principle that began in the beginning of the universe. So the same principle would be operating at this microscopic level that was operating at the beginning of the formation of the universe, which is obviously a very creative process and a whole lot of So you know,
and
this
also,
would be
sound is still at work today, of course, in our world. It's at work at every scale and every level. It's still working today. And so it's a fascinating subject, Daniel. Really, you can see why I'm
It is.
I'm
It
so
is.
in this
I took
subject.
I
It's
took
a
an extraterrestrial life class. I said for years that one of my favorite classes I ever took in college was extraterrestrial life at UT Austin, and
wow.
they have one of the main observatories and American observatories there outside of Austin, and so it was a great astronomy department there. And I took an astronomy class and an extraterrestrial life class, and the whole semester was about what are the odds that we have connected with extraterrestrial life. And it was the whole semester on the formation of solar systems and the formation of planets, and what are the odds that there's others like ours out there, and so on and so on. And it was a fascinating class. And how does life form? And and this definitely takes that topic to a new level that I've never heard this before. So it's fascinating.
Well,
And
I sometimes in my presentations, Daniel, I talk about this idea that life can be formed through some kind of random event. So if the example I give is you take a watch, a mechanical watch, which has got a few hundred moving parts. You take all these parts and you put them into a flask and you shake the flask, right?
yeah,
How
keep
long
shaking.
would how long would it take for
Keep
all those
shaking.
parts to come back together as a working watch? Well, I think you know the answer. The answer basically is never.
Yeah,
It's just not going to happen. It would longer than the age of the universe, for those parts to come together and coalesce, as a working watch. So
yeah.
even if you've got all of these building blocks brought from space into the oceans of Earth, and they're being gyrated around by just random vibrations or whatever in the water, or even the bubbling sounds of the hydrothermal vents, that you still need an organizing principle. You
Right. That's
can't
exactly.
take them and expect them to suddenly form life, right?
Yeah, yeah. So maybe this is a good time to share this story, because I was thinking the same thing. There has to be some sort of something that will organize things in some way or other. And obviously sound does that in some very simple ways. Like, I don't have my piano on right now, but if I played this low note on the piano, it's vibrating at maybe 50 cycles a second. And so everything that it impacts is going to kind of start buzzing in relationship at some, between its own characteristics and this sound at um, and which sort of takes me to another question I'll get to a little bit later about the relationship, how important it is for relationship to be involved. Even with tracing quantum particles, we're not really seeing the particle, we're just seeing the effect that the particle has on the measurement device. And so just like you were saying, we're not really seeing the sound. We never really hear the wind. We hear the sound that the wind makes when it runs into the leaves in the trees and or whatever else, right? So we never really hear the thing. We just hear when things bump into each other. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and but I was going to say that one of the early insights that I had into the power of being human was I was probably about 8 years old or so, and we were watching a football game. We were big football fans and basketball fans in my hometown and my family. And I think the team must have been coming out. I can't remember exactly, but everybody's clapping and everybody's like, woo! And I just decided to just slow down the clapping, just to do this for some reason. I just thought, because I'd heard this happen before, but I'd never tried it. And so I just did this, and then whoever next to me started doing it, and then a third person in front of me started doing it. And once that third person started doing it, it wasn't probably 10 or 12 seconds until everybody on our side of the stadium was clapping like this, right?
Wow.
And I'm like 8 years old, and I'm going, that's pretty amazing. But an organizing principle.
Entrainment, basically, in that case, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But something that
Other people
people
picking up
can
on
organize
clapping.
around. And we have a drum circle in Asheville, and some buddies of mine started going out, and we used to drum just in our basements, and they went out and started drumming in this a park in downtown Asheville, and just started drumming, and people started showing up. Just when there's a beat going, people just are drawn to it. And it has become this thing. It's written up in travel magazines all over the place now. There are people who have moved to Asheville because of the drum circle in Asheville. And so
Wow.
power
Well,
of sound.
a little bit later, Daniel, when we talk about the music blood experiments that I conducted, drumming is a very important part of that. So we can touch on that a little bit later. But yeah, drumming is very important.
Well, so I'd love to hear you talk about the spherical nature of sound. How does that factor into all of this? And how's that
Well,
related to music?
yeah, sound is not a wave. That's the key statement that I need to make. Sound is not a wave. So how is this? You know, how is it that we are taught in schools, in colleges, in universities that sound is a wave? And if you go out into the street in Nashville or anywhere else, and you ask anyone what is the shape of sound, they might look at you a little bit strangely, but they will almost certainly say sound is a wave. And then if you say to them, well, show me that wave, show me what it looks like coming out of your mouth. You know, if I turn sideways now, they'll do something like this, right? So sound is coming out of your mouth like a wave. And of course, the reality is completely different. When scientists or engineers talk about sound waves, what they're actually talking about is the graph of sound. But nature does not work in graphs, right? So this is where the misnomer comes in and the misunderstanding comes in. Because if you look at the graph of sound on, say, an oscilloscope, I probably can't see one, but we have an oscilloscope behind here, just about see it, this device here.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at sound on an oscilloscope, of course it looks like a graph because sound is actually following what's called a sinusoidal mathematical law. It's the natural vibratory law of sound. And when you put that into an oscilloscope device or any kind of device that shows sound graphically, then you will indeed see a wave, right? So the word sound wave has come from this graphic depiction of sound, but the reality for nature is completely different. So what is it? Okay, well, if you clap your hands together, you can visualize what's happening. The molecules in one hand are slapping against the molecules in your other hand and creating sound. The sound is leaving that event, that sound event, in all directions equally. In other words, sound is actually audible sound at any rate are spherical. They're not waves at all. they're literally spherical. And so all sounds are actually bubble-like. Let's call them bubbles, sound bubbles. And on the pattern, on the surface of that bubble is a beautiful pattern relating to the harmonic structures within the sound. So if you play your piano, Daniel, what's emitting from the soundboard in the piano are these beautiful bubbles with patterns on the surface. So where does the sound wave and the sound bubble, you know, how do they fit together? Okay, so when this event, this hand clap, say, causes a sound to propagate away from my hands, that bubble is actually oscillating in and out with the sound that's been created by that clap, right? So the bubble is oscillating in and out. And if you take that oscillation and you graph it, then it looks like a wave. But nature, don't forget, is not concerned with graphs. It's concerned with the actual physical space form of the energy. And the space form of the energy is spherical. So really, we should be talking about sound bubbles, not sound waves. And by the way, the same thing occurs with electromagnetism. So light, which is, you know, is electromagnetism, is also spherical. It also propagates spherically. The only type of light that does not propagate spherically, of course, is from a laser, which is we could call it a man-made version of light. But even with a laser, if you could create laser light that would be spherical, then it would still be spherical. It's only the fact that what you're seeing with a laser is one ray, let's say, of a myriad of rays that would actually propagate spherically. And if it was happening in nature, it doesn't happen in nature as it happened here, but if it did, it would be spherical. It's only the fact that you're artificially creating a single ray of light with the laser. But all radio frequencies, all microwave frequencies, all X-rays or gamma rays, they all propagate spherically. Everything does in the universe.
So how does that, I'm trying to figure out whether to ask this question or to step a little bit, maybe it does relate into the work that you're doing to look at how sound triggers mechanisms in our bodies that triggers healing responses in our bodies. I guess that's one of the things that I'm really more interested in talking with you about, is like, how does that, and maybe the spherical nature of it is related to that, but I'm real curious how, because I've always imagined that, yeah, it's probably true that sound has a healing influence in the body just by helping us to, our bodies to reorganize itself. But you probably could be a lot more articulate about that. It's probably much more beautiful than the way I put it.
Well, if you go back to the sound bubble, this idea, whatever sound you create, whether it's from a hand clap or your piano or your own voice, you're creating these beautiful bubbles of sound. But within that bubble, of course, there are trillions and trillions of collisions occurring between the atoms and the molecules. So if we talk about air is a gas, of course, or a mixture of gases that contains some mainly molecules, a few types of atoms as well, but essentially it's mainly molecules. And what happens is the one molecule is vibrating, and when it bumps into or collides with another molecule, the vibrations of this one are passed on to this one. They collide, and they're now both vibrating in the same way. That happens like a series of dominoes, but in all directions simultaneously. So the sound will propagate away. Now, this type of collision in scientific terms is called an inelastic collision. And what that means is that some energy is being lost every time there's a collision between two atomic particles, whether they're atoms or molecules, doesn't matter. Whatever type of collision we're talking about, some energy will be lost. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you say you go outside now and you shout loudly or you sing loudly, it means that your voice, the energy in your voice, will be effectively lost after about 1 mile, give or take, depending on how powerful your voice is. Because what's happening is the energy is being, every time there's a collision between two particles, some energy is being given up, right? So the sound gets weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. And so within about 1 mile, roughly, that energy is gone. You've used it, basically. It's all being used up in terms of it's being transferred into heat energy. That's what's happened. So the collisions that I'm talking about create friction, right? It's the term that we normally use. If you rub your hands together vigorously now, you will feel warmth. That warmth is occurring because the friction, the skin molecules in one hand are slipping past the skin molecules in your other hand, and every time you're doing that, you're literally creating friction, which creates heat. And that heat is simply infrared electromagnetism. So coming back to any sound, when you make sound, however you make it, with a hand clap, with a piano, with your voice, or any other way, you are not only propagating sound, you're also propagating or creating, let's say, infrared electromagnetism. And the infrared, the beautiful thing about this is that the infrared electromagnetism that you create that way is modulated in amplitude by the sound. So if we go outside, say, and we sing to the sky, right? Okay, our voice will reach roughly 1 mile up into the atmosphere, right, before it disappears into noise. But the infrared component of our voices will not be stopped by the atmosphere. The atmosphere of Earth is not unduly attenuating infrared electromagnetism, it will allow it through, allow it to pass. So if you go and sing outside to the sky, the information in your voice will literally be going into space, where it will go forever, basically, unless it meets some dense matter. It's a very poetic thought, isn't it? You know, that when we sing to the sky or sing to the stars, that one day our songs will literally reach the stars, not as sound, but as infrared electromagnetism that's modulated by our own vocal apparatus. So where does this all come into healing? Well, it comes into healing because when a sound therapist or a sound healer works with a patient or works with a client, and they're using some device, it could be a piano. You know, we have a friend in Florida who invites people into his home. He's a piano technician, actually. Dan Kohler, he's a wonderful piano technician, and people lie under his piano, you know, to absorb the beautiful vibrations from the piano. But, you know, sound therapists also use gongs, they use harps, they use Tibetan bowls, they use all sorts of other sound creating apparatus. But however, whatever type of apparatus you use for your sound therapy or your sound healing, all those sounds are actually creating infrared light that is modulated by those sounds. So the question we need to ask is, when a sound therapist or a sound healer works with a patient or a client, what is actually creating the healing benefit? What's triggering the body's response to that sound, the healing response of the body to that sound? Is it the sound itself, or is it the infrared component of the sound? And the reason I say that is because there's a lot of recent research that's been coming out last few years, particularly concerned with how cells communicate with each other, you know, their brothers and sisters. How do they communicate information around your body? And it turns out that they're communicating, the main way they communicate is in the infrared spectrum. So they send signals to each other, they're speaking to each other in infrared. So this is why this big question comes up, you know, is the sound therapy a result of the sound, the physical mechanical pressure, which is the sound, or is it the infrared component of the sound? It's a big question.
Well, that is just blowing my mind, because that's a question I've had for about 40 some odd years. And I've been hearing some really interesting responses to this, over the larger question, with several other people on this summit. But what you just said brought two or three things together. One is that it's not necessarily, because the physical influence of sound has never seemed to me to be fine enough to heal a kidney or something. You know, I can sort of see, I can imagine that maybe there's some sort of a gross level organization of the kidney that the physical sound could somehow reorganize and realign in some way, but it's never quite made sense how that could happen. And Bruce Lipton talks about the influence of our thoughts on the energetic environment in our bodies, and how powerful that is in terms of the health of our cells. And so we're talking about some really fine level stuff. And you know, Jonathan Goldberg talks about sound plus intention equals healing. And so there's something about that intention that seems true. And what you're saying there is like, oh, well, and because you also, when you told me this story years ago about that it's the electromagnetic radiation that can travel to a star, you told me that. And you also said that that our thoughts also emit electromagnetic radiation. And you said that energy comes through our eyes, and it comes, you know, our skulls are thick enough to block it, but that energy can come through our eyes and our ears. You told me this, and in our throats. And so our thoughts literally have power. They have energetic power. And Bruce Lipton says the same thing and talks about the influence of that on our and of course, a lot of people are saying it in, maybe less scientifically clear ways, but that our intentions matter. And so what you just pulled together for me was that our intentions, that electromagnetic radiation is the level of detailed, fine level information that could carry some of that fine little information that is put into a sound. So
Exactly.
if I play this and I'm angry and I play these same notes and I'm angry, it's going to have a whole different energy than if I'm feeling peaceful, and there's a different thing that's going on that can be felt, and maybe that's a big part of the healing.
Well, it's a very big question. How does sound heal? How does sound trigger the body's healing response? I'll give you a few. I give you viewers a few little tips now about how this might work. A lot of them are hypothetical, so you can either believe them or not. But a lot of this is from years and years of work that I've been engaged in. And so, first of all, going right back to what happened in the Great Pyramid, one of the things was that all the pain left me, right? So what's the mechanism for that? Well, it turns out this is a real mechanism. I'm not talking hypothetically now. This one I'm going to mention now is real. I mean, it's proven, right? And it actually does require sound, and it requires sound from the point of view of the mechanical pressure the sound creates. So now let's talk about the nociceptors in your body. What are these? Nociceptors are basically the nerve endings, and there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them, probably millions actually, all over your body. There's about 100,000 in each hand that you have. So these are nerve endings. This is why the tips of your fingers are so incredibly sensitive, and why it's why you can feel with such sensitivity is because you have all, and by the way, also why if you hurt your finger, it really does hurt, because you have all these nociceptors, right? So these nociceptors are connected to what are called afferent fibers. Afferent just means to travel inward. And so basically these afferent fibers are different types of afferent fibers. I'm not going to go into all the details right now, but suffice to say that every type of afferent fiber that's in your body, these are nerve fibers basically, every type of afferent fiber is sensitive to mechanical pressure. And so it turns out that the mechanism by which pain is mediated by sound is the following. When sound of a particular frequency, particularly when a particular frequency of sound enters your body, it travels to the midbrain, and it travels through these nociceptors and through these afferent fibers to the midbrain. And in the midbrain receives these and creates opiates. And the opiates actually block the signal, the pain signal. It's like telling your brain, I don't want this pain, therefore I'm going to block it. And it blocks it by creating opiates, natural opiates in the midbrain. And that stops the pain happening. And so this is a natural process. You've got to have the correct frequency. You can't just
my next question.
It's got to be the right frequency. If you get the right frequency, then you can block the pain simply by sound. And one of the things that happens is if you strike your thumb with a hammer, say, right, it hurts like ow, and you go ow. Well, that's the first thing. You've created a sound, right? Yeah. Ow, very loud sound probably, and there might be one or two expletives following it, but it's a sound, right?
Which are very helpful. Definitely helpful.
It is helpful, but the other thing that you will do when that happens is you'll immediately hold your thumb, right, and you will press it tightly. Well, this tight pressure is mechanical pressure, and this tells it's when you press on your thumb, you're sending a signal through the nociceptors, through the afferent fibers to the midbrain to say, create opiates, stop pain, right? So you know that if you do something like that, or if you bang your shin on something and you hold it firmly, it will definitely mediate the pain. So that's one mechanism, but of course it's a kind of temporary temporary fix, right? It's not going to be permanent. However, of course, if you're using sound therapy tools, you can create mediation of pain for quite a long period of time, certainly several hours at any rate. So that's one mechanism. But let's talk about illness now in the body. And there are many different forms of illness, of course. And I'm going to take cancer out of the equation here because that's a very specific form of illness. But if we think of all the other types of illnesses that can occur in your body, what happens typically is that an illness means that a system of your body is not functioning normally. It's not functioning nominally as it should. The reason for that is because the cells of this system, or in this system of your body, have gone to sleep. It's called the G0 phase in biology, and it means that the cells in that system of your body are in sleep mode. Why? Because of some event that's occurred. This event could be you've ingested some toxicity from some substance. You have ingested a pathogen, that's literally attacking this system of your body. You have had a physical trauma of some kind. But whatever the reason for this, that system of your body has shut down and it's saying, I want to rest, I want to sleep, and it will. And it's an automatic function of the body. Because when that happens, it puts your whole body out of balance. You're no longer in balance because of this one system, or maybe multiple systems, but certainly at least one system has shut down and it's waiting for healing. If you read the medical literature, Daniel, what you'll find is that it talks about how cells move from G0 phase, where they're not replicating in this kind of comatose state, move from G0 to G1, which is the start of the cell cycle, where the cell is building up to replication, right? In other words, joining the normal cell cycle of the body. For that to happen, you need a stimulus of some kind. And the medical literature, in terms of stimulus, will talk about, first of all, rest. This is why your MD, if you've got some illness, will say, I think you need a good rest.
Yeah.
There's a lot of truth in that, because time is a great healer.
Yeah.
The body needs rest, and rest is certainly going to help those cells to recover naturally, right? Another thing that you might be surprised at is that the medical literature talks about a good injection of nutrition. The reason I say this with a smile is because, most MDs will not actually talk to you about nutrition. I mean, I know there are specialist holistic practitioners who will, but the mainstream medical world, they're not particularly interested in nutrition. But if you study the literature, the medical literature, they are. So there's a kind of division here between what the scientific medical literature is talking about and what is actually being practiced in medicine on a day-to-day basis. But anyway, aside from the politics of all of that,
I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that helps to reassure me that at least there are some researchers out there that are getting some of that stuff published. So that's good to know. But
absolutely. I mean, we talk just to mention our friend and colleague Saya G, who is a wonderful guy who has started greenmedinfo.com. Greenmedinfo.com is probably the best natural health related website in the world, right? Bar none that I know of. Anyway, what Saya G did was he researched thousands and thousands of medical papers and made them available through his website. So if you go on his website, you will find a huge amount of information on natural health without any charge whatsoever. It's all free. But if you want to go deeper and you want to look at literally, put a keyword in for some form of cancer, for example, and you want to know what science has been conducted on this specific cancer, right? You can put that keyword in if you're a member. You have to then join, the small subscription fee. But then you get all this scientific information. The strange thing is, and Sayer himself will say this, is that most of the information that's been gathered from research that's in these medical papers never gets to the GP, the general practitioner. It just doesn't happen. It can take decades, if ever, for this research to surface to the point where it's being practiced. So there's a huge body of information out there that's being conducted all the time in medical world, but it doesn't get to the hospitals. It doesn't get to the medical doctors, unfortunately. And I don't know why that is, but it seems to be the fact. Anyway,
I do.
so coming back to this whole question. So here we have a system of the body that's in G0 phase. All the cells are asleep. The body's in imbalance. The medical literature says you need sleep, rest, or you need a good injection of nutrition. Either of those things can stimulate those cells, that system of cells, to come back onto the cell cycle. But the third way is through sound, because sound is also a form of energy, right? And as we know, mechanical energy plus infrared energy, and when that enters into this system of cells, the cells are encouraged to wake up and to move into the G1 phase. It doesn't happen instantly. It happens, over a period of hours. So being treated with sound is not something that's going to literally, it's not like waving a magic wand. You need a little bit of time for it to work, but it will work over sessions. And it basically, those cells then wake up and rejoin the cell cycle. But there's another aspect to all of this, Daniel, that I'd like to share very briefly.
Just that one point. I just want to stop you for a second. That one thing you just said right there is huge. It's just huge for me, and maybe for a lot of others. That there is a specific process by which sound is literally helping cells to come back to life, to awaken, and to find their place in existence in a way that's that's helpful to us. So that's just, I just wanted to sort of mark that and say thank you for that contribution to my understanding, and I'm sure a lot of others. So, and continue on.
Well, thank you. The thing is, I do want to underline at this point, just to go back to what I said earlier, that the pain mediation mechanism is real, it's proven, right?
And this other mechanism still under theory.
This other mechanism now is hypothetical, but from all of the research that I've been doing, it seems to be coming to be real, right? So, you can believe it or you don't believe it, but essentially it's currently hypothetical. But there's another mechanism that is not hypothetical that I'm now going to briefly talk about. And it's related to what I mentioned earlier about in the hydrothermal vents and abiogenesis in the primordial oceans of Earth, where we have these bubbles coming up out of the core of the Earth. And when there's sound present, which there is simply because when you have bubbles coming out of a hydrothermal vent, there is what's called wideband noise. It's like white noise. It contains thousands and thousands of frequencies, right? So the bubble, any bubble, will automatically select the frequency at which it resonates. So that each little bubble contains a volume of gas, right? Which is, the gas that's come up out of the core of the Earth. And that little volume of gas has a specific resonant frequency. And it automatically selects the frequency from this noise that's occurring all around it, right? It just selects the frequency at which it's most resonant and creates a pattern on the surface. This is an automatic mechanism. Now let's talk about sound coming into one's body. The same kind of principles occur because every cell in your body has a membrane, of course, And that membrane, as you'll know from the work of Bruce Lipton and others, have hundreds of little integral membrane proteins that project from the membrane of the cell. And these are the
Receptor cell.
ways that these are the ways that the cell communicates with its brothers and sisters, takes in food, excretes waste product, and all of these different mechanisms. They're all related to these little proteins that are projecting from the cell membrane. So
Yep.
now, if you think sound coming into your body, whether it's from a piano or from a voice or from a Tibetan bowl or from a gong or from a harp or whatever, right? Those sounds literally manifest a cymatic pattern. This is real, a cymatic pattern on the surface of every cell in your body, right? And what happens then? Well, it's really interesting, this research, because when the sound changes slightly, say, you're playing the piano, what's happening is when you play the piano or any musical instrument or make any kind of musical sound, there are phase shifts occurring all of the time because the frequencies, these complex frequencies from a piano, say, are mixing and mingling all the time and changing. If you press even one note on a piano and just wait and listen, you will hear the sound change a lot over a period of a few seconds. As it decays, it's always these harmonics are mixing and mingling all the time. Well, what does this mean for cymatics? It means that that sound, when it manifests on the surface of the cell, is not going to be static. It's going to be rotating like this around the surface of the cell.
Hmm.
Now think about the IMPs, the integral membrane proteins that are projecting from the cell. They're going to be massaged beautifully as this sound rotates around, as the cymatic pattern rotates around the cell. Just think of the massaging that's occurring for the cell. So if the cell's not happy, if it's either asleep in the G0 phase or it's just not happy, it needs more energy than it's got, then this sound, like nutrition, is a form of energy. So this is why you feel so good when you play the piano, Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone
Yeah.
plays a music instrument,
Yeah.
it's basically food for the soul, but it's also food for the cells.
That is just so incredible. What what you just gave me, the part that you keep filling in these little holes for me, and one of them has to do with the particular frequency. I've always wondered, it's like, I totally get that you can put a tuning fork, for example, on a particular organ, and that maybe it may somehow organize that organ back to health somehow or other. But I've always wondered, well, how would we know what this particular frequency to send it would be? I mean, how would I know whether, if my kidney was unhealthy, would it need the same frequency as your unhealthy kidney? And it's like, it's always seemed to me that it would have to be much more finely tuned than that. And what you just offered is the idea that, well, just feed it a lot of different frequencies, feed it white noise, and they will pick their own resonant frequencies just innately, and they will take the energy that they need and feed themselves with it.
You've got it right. You've got it exactly right, Daniel. Right? The reason that sound therapy works, sound healing, whatever the term you want to use, the reason it works is because if you use complex sounds, such as from a gong, a harp, a Tibetan bowl, they're all really beautiful, complex sounds that contain thousands of frequencies. Providing the sound pressure level is kept moderate, right? And then when I say moderate, I'm talking in technical terms here between 75 and 85 dBA. That's a
Hmm.
moderate sound level. It's comfortable to the ears, it's comfortable to your whole organism. Providing it's moderate, the cells will simply take the frequencies that they need and simply reject those that they don't need. It's just pure natural resonance. If the sound level is 90 dBA or higher, this is a different situation. That actually stresses the cells, that they're now trying to protect themselves from the sound that's coming in, and that stresses them. So very high sound levels from 90 above are not helpful at all to one's health. But
Mm.
lower sound levels, 75, 85, really helpful. And then below 75, what I found in the lab here is virtually no biological effect. So that's to say that if you're listening to music that's below 75 dBA, it doesn't mean you won't be getting any benefit. You will still be getting the psychological benefit of the beautiful music that you're listening to. So it's coming through your ears, your brain is interpreting this, it knows it, it's comfortable with this music, it loves it. Therefore, you're getting a kind of sound therapy point of view, sound therapy,
Maybe maybe stress reducing and
yeah,
therapeutic.
stress reduction, this type of thing. It does help reduce stress, it lowers blood pressure, all of that type of thing, but it doesn't necessarily have a biological effect on every cell in your body. Whereas as soon as you get to 75 to 85 dBA, the cells in your body are actually responding directly then to the music itself.
Hmm.
And this is what I found with the music blood experiments. The reason I'm able to quote these figures is because I've actually conducted the research, right? And I suppose most of your listeners will know of Pythagoras and what he said, you know, like 500 BCE, that music could be used in place of medicine. You know, it's kind of common knowledge that he said that. And but it really hadn't been tested. I came to realize that no one had conducted tests to kind of prove that statement on a biological level. I'm talking, you know, not as music therapy level, but you know, literally biologically. And
Yeah.
by the way, the happy news now, you know, is that there's a new term in medicine, music medicine. This is literally a clinical term. It's
Hmm.
coming into the clinical language, and it's really
Wow.
wonderful. So whereas a music therapist will work with a patient, with a client, well, they would be called patients, I think. Then they will work, you know, choosing music that helps that person to, as you say, you know, to lower their blood pressure and so on. All sorts of benefits from music therapy. But now, if we talk about music medicine, it's a biological effect that happens on the body, within the body, regardless of whether there's a therapist there. It just happens, right? And so anyway, coming to this business of these experiments that I conducted to prove, you know, the effects of music in terms of the biology, I designed this really simple experiment, Daniel, using human blood. And so, in a nutshell, we take a small test tube of human blood and we decant it into two smaller test tubes. So one of them will go into our Faraday cage in the lab here, which is a it's a shielded, electromagnetically shielded box, but it's also very, very quiet in there. It's quieter than the quietest bedroom. And in there we have a little incubator. So we put the blood into the incubator in the Faraday cage. So it's in this really quiet environment. And that's at 37 degrees, which is normal blood temperature, 37 centigrade, normal blood temperature. And then the other vial of blood, we put that into the laboratory, main part of the laboratory here, into another incubator, in which is a small loudspeaker. So now we can play music to this blood for 20 minutes, and 20 minutes is the prescribed period of time for a biological effect.
Hmm.
And what we found, absolutely astonishing. So the blood that's in the Faraday cage, we do a blood count on that. How many red blood cells are living after 20 minutes? And then do the same with the vial of blood that's been exposed to music. And the result was astonishing, absolutely astonishing. Several times more blood cells, several more ratio in terms of, you know, living cells in the quiet environment versus living cells in the musical environment, several times more, in some cases up to 20 times more red blood cells living in the musical environment than in the quiet environment. Well, why should this be? What's the mechanism, right? And this is what I'm coming back to the drumming thing, right, that we talked about earlier. That we don't know this for sure. This is again hypothetical, right? But we've got the facts. We know the facts that music really does extend the life of red blood cells. The question is, how? Okay, so hypothetically, this is what happens. When music enters into blood, certain low frequencies within the music actually release oxygen that's already dissolved in the blood. But in your body now, let's talk about in your body as opposed to in a test tube. In your body, the way that the hemoglobin molecules in your bloodstream are able to absorb oxygen is because of your heart, right? That's the only reason they can do it. So every time you have a heartbeat, that pressure, as a mechanical pressure, causes the hemoglobin in your blood cells to absorb oxygen that's already there, dissolved in the blood. That comes from your breathing, of course, right? If your heart stops, well, we know what happens. You lose consciousness within seconds, right? Because there's not enough blood, not enough oxygen getting to your brain, right? Mm-hmm. So oxygen is the key, not only for your consciousness, but also in this case for this hypothetical mechanism by which red blood cells can be repaired. So if we take this vial of blood that we've put into the laboratory incubator here with the music going, what's happening is in that vial of blood, you will have probably millions. Yeah, you'll have millions of red blood cells that are living and healthy. You'll have millions that are already dead. Why? Because they're dying all the time in your body. We get sent the blood from a blood bank here. And so when we receive it, it's pretty fresh. It's like being taken from the person the day before. But already there are millions of dead red blood cells. But this is the key. There are also millions that are in a kind of transitory phase. They're not dead, and they're certainly not very happy. The outer membrane of the red blood cell is starting to lose its integrity, starting to break up. In other words, it's transiting towards death. So it's kind of, it's in medical terms, it'd be called an old red blood cell. It's leading towards death. Now, what happens is the way that we count these red blood cells is we stain, first of all, we put a blue stain in called trypan blue, which stains all of the cells that are able to absorb the stain. The living cells cannot absorb the stain because the membrane has integrity and it simply rejects the stain. The dead cells cannot stop anything happening, so they absorb the stain straight away. The transitory cells, transitory red blood cells, if they are losing integrity, they will absorb the stain, unfortunately, right? But if you repair them with music, they won't. They don't absorb the stain anymore. So what's happening is within 20 minutes, Daniel, we have repaired millions and millions of red blood cells that would otherwise have absorbed the stain. Now they no longer absorb the stain. And different types of music have some have more effect than others.
Yeah,
and
that was my next question.
Guess what? The music that has the most effect is pop music, right?
Pop
the
music.
most benefit comes from pop music or rock music, right? This is astonishing, because it's
The music we want to
counterintuitive.
listen to.
You would think classical music would be the best. No way, right? It's pop music and rock music and drumming music. I tried every type of music you can imagine, maybe not every type, but I tried a lot, of different types of music, lots of different classical music selections, rock music, pop music of every genre, jazz, everything you can imagine, and white noise, as you mentioned earlier. I tried all these different things, and every single case, there were a lot more red blood cells living, even with the classical, a lot more red blood cells living than in the quiet. But with certain types of music, particularly those that have a really solid thumping beat, wow, look at the ratios. They were off the charts, up to 20 times more red blood cells living, right? and it's all, and I think, this is hypothetical again, please remember that, but I think it's all due to the pressure
Yeah,
pulse of
yeah, it's that
which
heartbeat,
acts like a heart. It's like a
right?
heartbeat, basically, and it's coming into your body, all the time. And in our case, in the lab here, it's going into the little test tube, right, and causing the hemoglobin. It's giving permission to the hemoglobin to uptake the oxygen, right, because of the pressure pulse coming in. And so when it uptakes the oxygen, now it has the tools to repair the proteins that are causing loss of integrity in the membrane, you see? So now you've got the oxygen available. Now we can do the repair, guys, repair the proteins, reject the trypan blue stain when it comes in, say no to that. And then the cell counter, the automatic cell counter, gives this fantastic result. We were so amazed by this, quite honestly, Daniel. We really
That is
were.
so, that's incredible. So like go to the clubs and play more hip hop.
Exactly. But again, remember what I said earlier about the pressure, sound pressure levels.
Can't be
Keep it
above
within
75.
75, 85. Yeah, 75 to 85. Don't go into the 90 because the 90 will actually start to harm you.
Huh.
Above 90, 90 and above will start to harm.
You know, this
Anyway, it's
is
fascinating.
this is fascinating and so rich. And this seems like there's just so many different kinds of questions that this presents now. It's like what kinds of different, what kinds of different grooves might be better, or, maybe blood from someone who grew up in this culture. I wonder if that culture's music might actually work for that person's blood, and somebody who was raised in Africa, maybe they might, respond to, so many fascinating questions there. But what you're affirming and reaffirming is the power of of music to actually have a literal impact in the health of a cell, not just an
Exactly.
experience or, oh, I just feel better, but it's like it's literally helping to heal.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And I think even though so far we've only conducted these experiments with blood, I have every reason to believe that these effects are not just having benefit on our blood, but also on other aspects of our biology, other types of cells. Why not? But we need to do that work, obviously, to prove that point.
Right, right. Well, it's not to me. I was a quantitative statistician for several years in the '80s, a social statistician, and I came to the point of thinking, that once you get enough information that makes sense, that kind of resonates with other things that we know about life, why not just go ahead? I mean, if it's not harmful, it's not going to be harmful to be listening to music that's between 75 and 85 dB, and that's music that you like. It's not going to be harmful. So why not just do it a little bit more on the likelihood that it may actually be beneficial, given what you've been, observing. So
Very good point, Daniel. And also just one last thing, regarding this, and that is that concert pitch, there's a lot of
yeah,
controversy around concert pitch right now in the world. Many musicians are calling for the concert pitch to change from the kind of international standard of 440 for A4 down to 432 for A4. And so what I did in order to hopefully to shed light on that was with these music blood experiments, I actually asked for music to be sent to me from various musicians around the world who had tuned their instruments specifically to 432. So these were, these music selections were not just electronically altered, these were literally musical instruments that had been tuned to 432 hertz, and then other instruments that had been tuned to 444 hertz. So going up from 440
just
to
that side.
444. And so we tried all of these different concert pitches as well as all of these different genres of music. And what we found was literally no difference between any of the concert pitches. They all had very similar ratios of red blood cells versus the control in the Faraday cage. So where musicians will very often, these musicians who are talking about 432 hertz or 444 hertz being, somehow natural or somehow better than 440 tuning, I found no evidence for it. And I think, there's a very good reason. If you think about this in a kind of in a more detailed way, there's a really good reason for it. And it all comes back to the sinusoidal nature of sound. We talked earlier about sound not being a wave. And this is true. It's not a wave, it's a bubble. All audible sounds are bubble-like. But what is true is that this bubble is oscillating in a sinusoidal fashion. It means that it's oscillating in a smooth sine curve if you actually graph it, right? It's in and out all the time, but in the smooth sine curve. Well, if you now look at the formula for the sine curve, one of the ways that you can look at this is the relationship between phi, the golden ratio, which is prevalent throughout all of life, right, and the sine curve. And you will find many, many different relationships, mathematical relationships between phi, the golden ratio, and the sine curve. What does this mean? It means that every sound that you create on this earth, every normal natural sound you create with a piano or any other musical instrument or your own voice, every single sound you're creating is creating the phi ratio, right? So this is why, I think anyway, this is why it doesn't matter what the concert pitch is, right? As long as the sound is sinusoidal in nature, then it will have healing benefits because it's literally embedding the phi ratio into your tissues all of the time. And I think it's as simple as that, actually. The phi ratio is the magic ratio for all of nature. There's a wonderful book by a guy called Georgi Doski. It's called The Power of Limits. I recommend it to any of your viewers to get a copy of that book because it shows beautifully illustrated book that shows the power of phi ratio throughout all of life, and really highly recommend that book.
Cool, cool. This has just been mind-blowing in so many different kinds of ways, and I expected that it would be, and I'm just delighted that we had this opportunity to stretch into this. Thank you so much, so much. And I know that you have, yeah, I know that you have an offer or two to make to the folks here that made it this far.
I should explain to your viewers that all of the research that we do in this lab is self-funded. We're not, there's no institution paying us money or whatever. So one of the ways that we pay our way in the world is by commissioned work. So we have a website called soundmadevisible.com. And on that website, if you go to that website, you'll find one of the products that we sell that really does help support our research when we sell this product is called DNA voice signature. So, everyone, it's common knowledge, isn't it, that one's DNA is responsible for the color of our hair, the color of our eyes, the physiognomy of the face, the body structure, everything, comes through the DNA. It's common knowledge. It's probably less common knowledge that the voice itself, our own voice, right, is directly responsible for the DNA is responsible for our voice, right? And mine's going a bit gravelly now with talking so much. But anyway, so the voice is literally coming from our DNA. What we do as a service that helps support our research is to make people's voices visible, right? And every single person's voice is unique to them. And when it's made visible, there's a unique pattern created, and no two can ever be alike, right? So the special offer that we have, if you go to our website right now and have a look, you will see soundmadevisible.com and click on the DNA voice signature section, and you will see there all the ways that you can do that. You can literally use our online voice recorder to make a short recording of your voice, and then we make it visible, right? Well, the special offer is the price is normally $144 for this service, and for that service you get a high resolution 300 DPI image that you can then have printed in any form that you like at your local print shop, right away up to a yard square. Basically, you can have a huge print made from this because they're very high high definition prints, and they're beautifully colorized to your own choice of colors, which you'll all see on the website. And then when you go to the checkout, there's a coupon code there, and if you use the coupon code DNA DNAVS99, in other words, DNA voice signature 99, then you get it for $99 instead of 144. So it's, you know, it's a really good saving,
Yeah,
and
that's pretty
and
sweet.
it will help our research, because then it brings money in that we can use to buy blood and whatever else that we're doing, you know.
Well, and
So yes, thank
you know, what a great birthday present for somebody, you know,
you. Either
Valentine.
for yourself or a loved one, you know,
Yeah,
anyone would be delighted, I'm sure, to receive a beautifully printed version of your own voice. And it's like a legacy that you could pass on for generations to come, something that
absolutely.
can stay in the family. It's really a very, very worthwhile thing to do. And the other thing is, for anyone who would like to send in their email address and join our mailing list, there are two PDFs that we'd love to send you. We know you're interested in music, and I wrote an article a few years ago now, actually, on the history of concert pitch. So this is a really very well researched article on the history. But then much more recently, I wrote part 2 of that article, which concerns the scientific perspective of concert pitch, some of which, you know, I've just shared with you now. But
Mhm.
it's only a little bit. You know, if you read the article, it's really wonderful on all the information relating to the scientific aspects of concert pitch. So you'll get those two PDFs free if you just send in your email and join our mailing list. So
Very
yeah, that they're the offers, Daniel.
Very cool. Um, you know, just a note on the concert pitch. It's fascinating to hear your discussion about that, because I've been curious about it, and it sort of makes sense that if there's some sort of a natural, you know, from that something that emanates from the Schumann resonance or something that sort of comes through, and that maybe there's something a little bit more innately, you know, sort of harmonious about a particular set of frequencies than another. Sort of like, well, it kind of makes sense on that level, but on the other hand, there's so many different pitches and frequencies that happen in nature, you know, and I'm sure that they're not all just lined up on according to some, you know, some base frequency. It just didn't seem true. So it's kind of nice to hear this reassurance of my intuition on that.
Yeah,
Um,
well, one of the things, of course, is that, you know, a lot of people ascribe special meaning to, say, the number 432 or the number 444 or whatever number. But the
that would,
problem with that is that these numbers are actually arbitrary.
yeah,
And why are they arbitrary? Well, they're arbitrary because pitch and frequency are, they're both measured in cycles per second, you know, which is
yeah.
now called, but cycles per second. Well,
Second,
the period
what's
of time,
what's natural
the
about a
period of
second,
time called the second is
right?
arbitrary, right? It's
Right.
decided in history. And so if you change a second, say we all say, okay, 1 second, guys, is now going to be worth 1.2 seconds, right? If we all suddenly change the value of the second, this number 432 would be a completely different number, as would
Mhm.
all the other concert pictures, you know. So
Yeah.
really, the numbers themselves are completely arbitrary. But it's a fascinating subject, and I'm sure that many of your visitors would, you know, viewers would like to read these articles.
Well, absolutely, and I think that this I can't wait to do my own voice signature. I'd love to. That just seems like a perfect thing to put up over the piano, so that I can sort of remind myself that this is who I am. And this is
It would
my
be a great
expression.
pleasure to do that for you, Daniel.
This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. I know this went a little bit longer than either of us expected, but I've certainly enjoyed it, and I really appreciate
Oh,
it
I
very much.
very much enjoyed it. You know, I loved all of your comments, Daniel. Thank you so much for doing this.
Absolutely.
And you know, my whole reason for doing this research is not just for my own benefit, of course, but to share this information with the world. So that's why I'm, you know, doubly grateful for you taking this time to put this summit together, because it's helping not only my work but the work of all your other presenters to get their information out into the world. Thank you so much.
Good stuff. Absolutely. Onward, onward and blessing.